Welcome to A Dram of Outlander. This is Desiree, your podcaster and the writer for adramofoutlander.com. For all things Outlander, from the Diana Gabaldon book series to the Starz TV series and everything in between. This is podcast episode 136, week 22 of the Drums of Autumn read-along. So I've got some breaking news. I finally received our schedule for the Denver Comic-Con panel that I am doing alongside Courtney of Outlander Behind the Scenes and Karen of Outlander Medicine. It is going to be on Friday, 6/15/2018 at 6 p.m. in room 404, and it's called an Outlandish Outlander fan panel. I am super excited now that we have a date. We will also be doing sort of an after party that evening in a local hotel. So even if you can't make the Comic-Con and you're in Colorado, please come to our after party. It's going to be great fun. So we are very, very excited about that. Now that we know exactly when it is, we can make some extra plans for those who come. This week we are doing chapters 41 and 42, and I'm calling it Nobody Expects the Spanish Inquisition. And the summary goes something like this. Brianna and Lizzie get safely upriver to Cross Creek, though the girl had yet again become ill. Brianna borrows a mule to scout out Cross Creek. She meets Jamie. He's dubious at first, then filled with utmost joy. To Riverrun he takes her and Lizzie. Fergus is victorious at his trial. Jamie takes Brianna to Fraser's Ridge. Claire is shocked and happy. Jamie takes Brianna hunting. They become more comfortable with each other and share stories. Jamie is fretful later. Memories are shared between Claire and Jamie in the moonlight. Inside the chapters, Chapter 41, Journey's End. Brianna is aggravated that Lizzie is ill again. She woke after the night with Roger to clean clothes, a tidied space, and Lizzie fevered. Brianna is restless, knowing she only has 8 days to get to Cross Creek, or she could miss Jamie Fraser. Lizzie might be ready to travel in a couple of days, thought a frustrated Brianna. She went down to the taproom to get tea for the sick girl, and a man with roaming hands tried to grab her behind. Squeezing through the crowded tables, she notices a gold ring at a gambling table. The light hit it just right, and she knew the engraving pattern within. She stopped and approached the man who held it. She pretended to rub it for luck, and she was right. She did know the ring. From F to C with love, always, it read. She was eager to find out where he, the Irishman, got it from. She was worried for her mother. She planned to see the Irishman the following day in the daylight for safety. He agrees and tells her to go to the Gloriana. Yes, you remembered it correctly. It is Captain Stephen Bonnet, the man who Jamie and Claire saved from execution when he was found hidden in their wagon. The man who later stole from them when they were headed upriver to Auntie Jo's. This cannot be a good thing, Brianna running into him. The kind Dutchwoman is in awe of the amount of food Brianna ate. She had not eaten in a couple of days. She accepted a second helping of food. Lizzie's fever had returned 2 days upriver. Brianna thought she might die this time. They had made it to Cross Creek. Tomorrow she would find Jamie Fraser. She felt the ring in her secret pocket. Knowing her mother was alive was all that mattered. The Dutchwoman was the sister of one of the men she traveled with upriver. She would take care of Lizzie while Brianna borrowed the mule for a trip into Cross Creek to find the courthouse and to gain familiarity with the city. She didn't want to take any chances she might miss Jamie. She had not noticed anything on the second half of their journey. Her mind had been occupied with Lizzie and painful thoughts of her own. Now that she was writing, she could see the countryside and how it changed. She wonders how it will be to meet him, Jamie Fraser. Would he be happy to see her? What might he say? She could hear the echoes of Leary calling him a liar and a cheat. She rode into town. Most people were inside to escape the heat of the day. She made note of landmarks, like the sawmill and a tavern. She feels hollow after searching for money in her pocket and finding something else. She stops at the tavern and gets a beer. The landlord asks if she's come for the trial. Brianna asks whose trial it is. Fergus Fraser is accused of attacking an officer of the crown. The tavern owner is sure he'll be acquitted, since Jamie Fraser came down from Fraser's Ridge to be at the trial. He happens to be there at the tavern and should return in a minute. Brianna leapt up and ran out the door. She spies Jamie peeing against a tree. When he turned toward her from the tree, he tensed, seeing her standing there, thinking she was a man at first. She was wearing breeks, of course. She saw him face on. She knew without a doubt who he was, though smaller. His face was her face. He speaks to her. "What do you want here, lassie?" he asked, sharp, but not unkind. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, the Highland burr slight but distant. "You," she blurted. Her heart seemed to have wedged itself in her throat. She had trouble forcing any words past it. He was close enough that she caught the faint whiff of his sweat and the fresh smell of sawn wood. There was a golden scatter of sawdust caught in the rolled sleeves of his linen shirt. His eyes narrowed with amusement as he looked at her up and down, taking in her costume. One reddish eyebrow rose, and he shook his head. "Sorry, lass," he said with a half-smile. "I'm a married man." He made to pass by, and she made a small, incoherent sound, putting out a hand to stop him, but not quite daring to touch his sleeve. He stopped and looked at her more closely. "No, I meant it. I've a wife at home, and home's not far," he said, evidently wishing to be courteous. But he stopped close enough now to take in the grubbiness of her clothes, the hole in the sleeve of her coat, and the tattered ends of her stock. "Och," he said in a different tone, and reached for the small leather purse he wore tied at his waist. "Will you be starved then, lass? I've money if you must eat." She could scarcely breathe. His eyes were dark blue, soft with kindness, her eyes fixed on the open collar of her shirt, where the curly hair showed bleached gold against his sunburnt skin. You're Jamie Fraser, aren't you?" He glanced sharply at her face. "I am." The wariness had returned to his face, his eyes narrowed against the sun. He glanced quickly behind him, toward the tavern, but nothing stirred in the open doorway. He took a step closer to her. "Who asks?" "Have you a message for me, lass?" She felt an absurd desire to laugh welling up in her throat. Did she have a message? "My name is Brianna," she said. He frowned, uncertain, and something flickered in his eyes. He knew it. He'd heard the name, and it meant something to him. She swallowed hard, feeling her cheeks blaze, as though they'd been seared by a candle flame. "I'm your daughter," she said, her voice sounding choked to her own ears. "Brianna." Ooh, that is a big, big moment. Imagine him hearing those words, "I'm your daughter." He became flushed red, a sight she found recognizable. He stopped and looked her over more closely. "My God, you're huge!" "And whose fault is that, do you think?" she snapped. She drew herself up straight and squared her shoulders, glaring. So close, at her full height, she could look him right in the eye, and did. He jerked back, and his face did change then, mask shattering in surprise. Without it, he looked younger. Underneath were shock, surprise, and a dawning expression of half-painful eagerness. "Och, no, lassie. I didn't mean it that way at all. It's only—" He broke off, staring at her in fascination. His hand lifted, as though despite himself, and traced the air, outlining her cheek, her jaw, and neck and shoulder, afraid to touch her directly. "It's true," he whispered. "Is it you, Brianna?" He spoke her name with a queer accent, Brianna, and she shivered at the sound. "It's me," she said a little huskily. She made another attempt at a smile. "Can't you tell?" He reaches out to touch her, stunned by her being fully grown. He thought of her as a wee bairn from the pictures. "Pictures?" she said, feeling breathless with happiness. "You've seen pictures of me? Mama found you, didn't she? When you said you had a wife at home." "Claire," he interrupted. The wide mouth had made its decision. It split into a smile that lit his eyes like the sun in the dancing tree leaves. He grabbed her arms, tight enough to startle her. "You'll not have seen her then? Christ, she'll be mad with joy." The thought of her mother was overwhelming. Her face cracked and the tears she had been holding back for days spilled down her cheeks in a flood of relief, half choking her as she laughed and cried together. "Here, lassie, dinna weep," he exclaimed in alarm. He let go of her arm and snatched a large crumpled handkerchief from his sleeve. He patted tentatively at her cheeks, looking worried. "Oh, dinna weep, Rhiannon. Dinna be troubled. It's all right. It's all right." "I'm all right. Everything's all right. I'm just happy," she said. She took the handkerchief, wiped her eyes, and blew her nose. "What does that mean, Rhiannon? And the other thing you said? You'll not have the Gaelic then?" "No, of course. She wouldn't have been taught," he murmured, as though to himself. "I'll learn," she said firmly, giving her nose a last wipe. "Rhiannon." A slight smile reappeared on his face as he looked at her. "It means darling," he said softly. "My blessing is the other word." Such emotion gripped them both. She had no idea how to address Jamie. Frank was her daddy and always would be. He tells her to call him Da. "You can call me Da," he said. His voice was husky. He stopped and cleared his throat. If you want to, I mean," he asked diffidently. "Da," she said, and felt the smile bloom easily this time, unmarred by tears. "Da. Is that Gaelic?" He smiled back, the corners of his mouth trembling slightly. "No. It's only simple." And suddenly it was all simple. He held out his arms to her. She stepped into them and found that she had been wrong. He was as big as she had imagined, and his arms were as strong about her as she had ever dared to hope. To be hugged by the father she had only known existed for a couple of years. I love this scene to my core. Jamie is meant to be a father. He's meant to be her father. He's right, Claire will be mad with joy. What do you love about it? Everything was a blur for Brianna from here on out. They had retrieved Lizzie from the Dutchwoman's home. They rode toward Riverrun. Jamie told Brianna about the house he's building for Claire, and the glass in the back is meant as a surprise for her mother. He's putting windows in the big house for her. It seemed a long ride down the dusty roads, but she slept with her head on his shoulder and his arm holding her close. Riverrun was a big house, and she met Aunt Jocasta, tall with a face like hers, but eyes that looked beyond her. Everything seemed to happen like magic, so many hands to help and make jobs quick. The haze of hands and faces of black slaves were in Brianna's mind. They bathed, dried, and dressed her in a fresh cotton gown. There was food, tea, and her father's joy-filled eyes upon her. There was a pretty blonde girl who seemed familiar somehow. Her name was Marsley. Lizzie, too, was cleaned up and wrapped in a blanket with hot tea in hand. Barely coherent, Brianna hears the names of Farquhar Campbell and Fergus before strong hands of her father lifted her and took her to bed. Fergus Fraser looked like a French noble on his way to the guillotine to Brianna. handsomely dark, slightly built, and not very tall. He sauntered into the dock and turned to face the room. Long nose lifted an inch above the usual. The shabby clothes, the unshaven jaw, and the large purple bruise over one eye subtracted nothing from his air of aristocratic disdain. Even the curved metal hook that he wore in replacement of a missing hand only added to his impression of disreputable glamour. That's because he is French and his name is Claudel. Jamie renamed him. Marsley is worried for the treatment Fergus may have gotten while in jail. There was a crowd filling the courthouse, not a seat to be had. There were soldiers guarding the doors, and one seated by the justice's bench. The man caught Jamie's eye with a malevolent air of satisfaction. Jamie kept his poker face, seeming indifferent. The justice arrived, and the proceedings began. Brianna thinks she has a handle on the people present. Phaedra, Marsley, young Ian, and Fergus. It was such a blur when she first arrived. The justice calls for the charges to be read. These were, to wit, that one Fergus Claudel Fraser, resident of Rowan County, had on August 4th of this year of our Lord, 1769, feloniously assaulted the person of one Hugh Barron, a deputy sheriff of said county, and stolen from him crown property, then lawfully in the deputy's custody. I wonder what exactly that means. Hugh took the stand and described the events of that day. Apparently he was wickedly lashed by the tongue in French. The justice gives Fergus the opportunity to speak. "This loathsome wad of dung," he began in measured tones, "had... The prisoner will refrain from insult," Justice Conant said coldly. "The deputy had come upon my wife as she returned from the flour mill with my infant son upon her saddle. This the deputy hailed her and without ceremony dragged her from the saddle, informed her that he was taking the horse and its equipment in payment of tax, and left her and the child on foot 5 miles from my home. And the blazing sun!" He glared ferociously at Baron, who narrowed his own gaze in reply. Next to Brianna, Marsley exhaled strongly through her nose. "What tax did the deputy claim was owed?" A dark flush had mantled Fergus's cheeks. "I owe nothing. It was his claim that my land is subject to an annual rent of 3 shillings, but it is not. My land is exempt from this tax by virtue of the terms of a land grant made to James Fraser by Governor Tryon. I told the stinking salaud as much when he visited my home to try to collect the money." "I heard nothing of such a grant," Baron said sulkily. "These folks will tell you any tale at all to put off paying, lollygags and cheats, the lot of them. Aurait enfui dessus." So Fergus basically called him a cauliflower ear, which I don't know why that's such an insult, but apparently it made everybody laugh. After this exciting testimony by Fergus, the justice asks if Jamie Fraser is present. Jamie is sworn in and answers all questions regarding the land deal he had with Governor Tryon. Brianna intently watched the proceedings and noticed the officer who leered at Jamie earlier was looking at Hugh. There was a nod of his head. As the justice was about to acquit Fergus, Hugh stands up and objects based on no proof of the land grant deal. Her father showed no anger, though. He rose again and bowed to the justice. "And your lordship will permit me." He searched into his coat and removed a folded sheet of parchment with a blob of red-sealed wax affixed. "Your lordship will be familiar with Governor Tryon's seal, I'm sure," he said, laying it on the table before Mr. Conant. The justice raised one eyebrow but looked carefully at the seal, then broke it open, examined the document within, and laid it down. "This is a duly witnessed copy of the original grant of land," he announced, "signed by His Excellency William Tryon." "How did you get that?" Baron blurted. "There wasn't time to get to New Bern and back. Then all the blood drained from his face. Brianna looked at the officer. His pudgy face seemed to have acquired all the blood Baron had lost. Jamie Fraser 1, Murchison 0. With evidence in hand, the justice acquits Fergus. Before stepping down, Jamie asked the justice if Baron's charge fully described the attack. The justice read the original complaint and had a light bulb moment. "Oh," said the justice and swiveled cold eyes toward the witness chair, where Baron squirmed in hot-faced agony. "And would you care to explain, sir, how you have sustained injury upon the right side of your face when struck by the left fist of a man who does not have one?" "Yes, crétin. Explain that one," Fergus said cheerfully. Perhaps feeling that Baron's attempts at explanation were best conducted in privacy, Justice Conant mopped his neck and put a summary end to the trial, dismissing Fergus Fraser with no stain upon his character. Woo! So Jamie won it all. Won it all. After concluding the trial, they went to Jocasta's house for a celebration feast. As they discussed the trial, it was revealed that Marcelie had been the one to assault the officer. She kicked him in the face when he tried to take her from the horse. The officer took Germain from her, and she had to get down then. It was Murchison wanting to make trouble for Jamie that set the farce of a complaint in motion. Jocasta was annoyed that Farquhar Campbell, the usual justice in the area, was taken off the trial. Jamie explains why. "Farquhar Campbell is the usual justice of this district. If he hadna fallen ill so conveniently," and here he grinned again, mischief dancing in his eyes, "the trial would have been held last week. That was their plan, aye? Murchison and Baron. They meant to bring the charge, arrest Fergus, and force me down from the mountain in the midst of the harvest. And they succeeded in that much, damn them," he added ruefully. "But they counted on my not being able to obtain a copy of the grant from New Bern before the trial, as indeed I could not, had it been last week." He gave Ian a smile, and the boy, who had ridden hell-bent to New Bern to procure the document, blushed pink and buried his face in a bowl of punch. "Farquhar Campbell is a friend, Auntie," Jamie said to Jocasta, "but you ken as well as I that he's a man of the law. It wouldn't make a bit of difference that he knows the terms of my grant as well as I do, if I could not produce the proof in court. He would feel himself forced to rule against me. And if he had," he went on, returning to Brianna, "I should have been forced to appeal the verdict, which would mean Fergus being taken to prison in New Bern, and a new trial scheduled there. The end of it would have been the same, but it would have taken both Fergus and myself off the land for most of the harvest season, and cost me more in fees than the harvest will bring." Jamie is always a step ahead of Murchison, it seems. Jamie looks at Brianna, asking her if she thinks him to be rich. It's not something that had entered her mind. He explains to Brianna the state of life on Fraser's Ridge. "That's as well. For while I've a good bit of land, there's a little of it under cultivation as yet. We've enough, barely, to seed the fields and feed ourselves, with a bit left over for the cattle. And capable as your mother is," the smile widened, "she canna bring in 30 acres of corn and barley by herself." He set down his empty cup and stood up. "Ian, will you see to the supplies and drive up the wagon with Fergus and Marcelie? The lass and I will go ahead, I think." He glanced down at Brianna, questioningly. "Jocasta will care for your wee mate here. You do not mind going so soon." "No," she said, putting down her cup and standing up too. "Can we go today?" Brianna is very eager to see her mother. Back at the ridge, Claire is going through her jarred stores, making sure none were moldy. This makes her think of having a penicillin plantation. If she were lucky, she could isolate the penicillium mold of the hundreds that grow on stale bread. Would any spores survive, or would she recognize it if they did? She had no success in over a year, but she would keep trying. She found it impossible to keep vermin out of the pantry. Even with marigolds and yarrow I scattered for repellency, it was impossible to keep the vermin away. Mice and rats, ants and cockroaches. One day I had even found a party of burglarious squirrels in the pantry, holding riot over scattered corn and gnawed ruins of half my seed, potatoes. Though she could lock all the edibles in the hutch Jamie built, the stale bread samples required air. Nyawene came to mind as she thinks about how every plant could cure illness, if only it was known what it was. She regretted not being taught more from her friend, but not as bitterly as the loss of Nyawene from the earth. She knew she needed to keep trying to grow the elusive penicillium. Much of the year she couldn't leave samples out because of the vermin, but in winter the air was too cold to allow for spore growth. She would try again in the spring. Their new house was taking shape up on the hill. It would be done by spring. I would have plastered walls and laid oak floors, glass windows with stout frames that kept out mice and ants, and a nice, snug, sunny surgery in which to conduct my medical practice. Clarence the mule shrieked with ecstasy. Claire hastily cleans up the bottles and corks. She hoped it was Jamie returning with Fergus and Marsley. She worried that Jamie's confidence about the trial hadn't come to fruition. After placing the last of the bottles in the cupboard, she went to the door. She saw no one. She saw nothing but evidence that somebody had come through. She wished she hadn't left her knife on the table. Somebody was there. Jamie spoke behind her. Sassenach. My heart nearly stopped at the sound of Jamie's voice. I spun toward it, relief being rapidly overcome by annoyance. What did he think? For a split second I thought I was seeing double. They were sitting on the bench outside the door, side by side, the afternoon sun igniting their hair like match heads. Bree knocked her off her feet with a bone-crushing hug. Mama! I hadn't any breath. What hadn't been taken away by shock was being squeezed out by a rib-crushing hug. Bree! I managed to gasp, and she put me down, though she didn't let go. I looked disbelieving up, but she was real. I looked for Jamie and found him standing beside her. He said nothing, but gave me a face-splitting grin, his ears bright pink with delight. I wasn't expecting, I said idiotically. Brianna gave me a grin to match her father's, eyes bright as stars and damp with happiness. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. What? Said Jamie blankly. Poor Jamie, left out again with a modern-day reference. Claire must have almost had kittens to see Brianna. I love how we are reintroduced to Marsley as a high-spirited young woman. Fergus with his French contempt is priceless. The character of Murchison is like a fever blister. He pops up when you least expect it. We meet Jocasta and the household staff through the eyes of Brianna. She accomplished her quest. She found her father, her Da. What happened to Brianna that she had painful worries on the way to Cross Creek? I wonder what Roger is up to. Part 10, Impaired Relations. Moonlight. Jamie wakes Brianna in the pre-dawn morning, asking her to come hunting with him. She dressed and went to the privy. The sky seemed dreamlike in quality. She could almost touch the stars. It was very early, she thought, as dark and quiet as it was. She gulped the fresh air as she returned to the confines of the cabin. Jamie was ready with hunting gear in tow. She watched him kiss her mother as she slept in bed. She felt like a voyeur. He knew she was there, of course, and it was no more than a light kiss on the forehead, but she felt like an intruder, a voyeur. The more so when Claire's long, pale hand floated up from the quilts and touched his face with a tenderness that squeezed her heart. Claire murmured something, but Brianna didn't hear it. She waited for him to come outside. With a nod of his head, she followed on the path. The quiet broke to sounds of birdsong, screeches, and other noises. Daylight rose with subtlety. They sat together eating apples and bread. Wiping her hands on her coat, she felt the presence of the conker in her pocket, a touchstone, a link to another life for the one who planted it. Were her links to the past severed for good? She followed Jamie uphill. At the top of the steep climb, she felt she could float away. For a single moment she wished that she could, but the links still held in the chain that bound her to the earth, her mother, her father, Lizzie, and Roger. The morning sun was rising, a great ball of flame above the mountains. She had to shut her eyes for a moment, not to be blinded. The climbing became easier as she found the rhythm of the ground. They reached the place he meant to take her. There was a split rock that caused her to hesitate for a moment. It reminded her of the stones. This caused Jamie momentary distress that he had to watch her safely climb through. He touched her to be sure she was still there. His timing was perfect. He had judged it right. The sun was just coming over the farthest ridge as they came out into the open space at the top of the slope. Below them spread ridges and valleys so full of mist that it looked like smoke boiling through the hollows. From the mountain opposite, the waterfall arced out and down in a thin white plume, falling into the mist. "Here," he said, stopping at a place where the rocks lay scattered, surrounded by thick grass. "Let's rest for a bit." Chilly as the early mornings were, the climb had heated him. He sat on a flat rock, legs stretched out to let the air come under his kilt and push the plaid off his shoulders. "It feels so different here," she said, brushing back a lock of soft red hair whose flames warmed him more than the sun. She glanced back at him, smiling. "Do you know what I mean? I rode from Inverness to Lallybroch, through the Great Glen, and that was wild enough." She shivered slightly at the recollection. "But it wasn't like this at all." "I think," he began, then stopped. Would she think him daft? But she was looking at him, wanting him to say. "The spirits that live there," he said a little awkwardly. "They're old, and they've seen men for thousands on thousands of years. They ken us well, and they're none so weary of showing themselves. What lives here?" He laid a hand on the trunk of a chestnut tree that rose 100 feet above them, whose girth measured more than 30 feet around. "They have not seen our like before." She nodded, seeming not at all taken aback. "They're curious, though, aren't they?" she said, "some of them," and tipped back her head to look up into the dizzy spiral of the branches overhead. "Don't you feel them watching now and then?" "Now and then." "That gives me shivers. I love to listen to the land and see what presents. Sometimes nothing shows up, and sometimes..." They sat for a long time watching as the sun came to full light. Jamie said a Gaelic prayer to the spirits. Brianna speaks first. "You didn't really mind, did you?" Her voice was soft, and she kept her eyes on the valley below, careful not to look at him, living in the cave near Brochmurra. "No," he said. The sun was warm on his breast and face and filled him with a sense of peace. "No, I didn't mind it. Only hearing about it, I thought it must have been terrible, cold and dirty and lonely, I mean." She did look at him then, and the morning sky lived in her eyes. "It was," he said, and smiled a little. "Ian, Uncle Ian, took me there to show me." "Did he then?" "It's not so bleak in the summertime when the yellow's on the broom." "No, but even then, when it was..." She hesitated. No, I didn't mind it. He closed his eyes and let the sun beat his eyelids. He learned to value the solitude. Then they sat and listened to nature speaking around them. She spoke of Roger, and Jamie's heart squeezed. She didn't think Roger understood being alone. She mentioned not minding being alone had to do with her and Jamie. He glanced at her, wanting badly to know what made her say so. What had Claire's life been in their years apart to give her that knowledge? It was so. Claire knew the flavor of solitude. It was cold as spring water, and not all could drink it. For some it was not refreshment, but mortal chill. But she had lived daily with a husband. How had she drunk deep enough of loneliness to know? Brianna could maybe tell him, but he wouldn't ask. The last name he wished to hear spoken in this place was Frank Randall's. He coughed instead. Well, maybe it's true, he agreed cautiously. I've seen women, and men too sometimes, as cannot bear the sound of their own thoughts, and they maybe dinna make such good matches with those who can. No, maybe they don't. Jamie thinks she had doubts about Wakefield. Mackenzie. Brianna had told them about her search, the death notice, her journey, damn Leary, and this Wakefield. He knows she didn't tell them everything, though. Why in the hell did Brianna use the name Wakefield when she knew Roger was using Mackenzie? Jamie's mind was troubled with the thought of Frank. He had won. Claire was his. So was this glorious child, this young woman, he corrected himself, looking at her. But Randall had had the keeping of them for 20 years. There was no doubt. He had set his mark on them. But what mark had it been? Brianna brought him from his thoughts by pointing out 2 does. The does stepped out without fear of them. That would never have happened in Scotland. Jamie was content being alone with his daughter. Brianna asked what they are hunting for. They had seen many animals throughout the day. He replied bees, and she wonders how bees are hunted. It turns out by finding certain types of flowers and watching what direction the honeybees go. They finally found what they were looking for in the late afternoon. Oh, good, Jamie said with satisfaction at the sight. Sometimes they hive in the rocks, and then there's little you can do. He unslung the axe at his belt and his bags and gestured to Brianna to sit down on a nearby rock. It's best to wait till dark, he explained, for then all the swarm will be inside the hive. Meanwhile, will you have a bite to eat? I think Brianna's, really going to eat all the time. She's not a little wafy thing. After sharing a meal, he showed her how to load and shoot the musket. She needed a little practice to get used to the feel of it. She was a good shot, though. Jamie asks how she learned to shoot. My father was a target shooter. She lowered the gun, cheeks flushed with pleasure. He taught me to shoot with a pistol or a rifle, a shotgun, too. Then her cheeks flushed a deeper hue, remembering. You wouldn't have seen a shotgun? No, I didn't suppose I have, was all he said, his face a careful blank. She moved the conversation back to the bees. He will blow smoke into the hive to stun them. He'll then wrap the hive in his plaid. He'll nail it to a piece of wood back at Fraser's Ridge, and in the morning the bees will go out looking for flowers. He said they will be content in the new place. They sat in silence again until Brianna asked if Claire would worry for them. He shook his head no. He asked her about men going to the moon. She told them they will go to the moon. He was curious. Aye, and what did they say of it, the men who went? They didn't need to say anything. They sent back pictures. I told you about the television. He looked a little startled, and she knew that, like most things she had told him from her time, he had no real grasp of the reality of moving talking pictures, let alone the notion that such things could be sent through thin air. "Aye," he said a little unsurely. "You've seen these pictures, then?" Brianna continues her description of the Apollo mission. It took hours waiting. No one could say exactly how long it would take them to land and get out of their spacesuits. "You know, there isn't any air on the moon." She raised a questioning brow, and he nodded, attentive as a schoolboy. "Claire told me so," he murmured. "The camera, the thing that made the pictures, was looking out of the side of the ship, so we could see the foot of the ship itself settled in the dust, and the dust rising up over it like a horse's hoof when it put its foot down. It was flat where the ship came down, covered with a soft, powdery kind of dust, with little rocks scattered on it here and there. Then the camera moved, or maybe another one started sending pictures, and you could see that there were rocky cliffs off in the distance. It's barren, no plants, no water, no air, but sort of beautiful in an eerie kind of way." He makes a joke about the moon sounding like Scotland. She can tell he misses it. It was time to get the hive and get back to the cabin. The night was warm enough to sleep with the windows. With the window covers rolled up. Jamie had been smiling since returning from Cross Creek, but that night he wasn't sleeping, even though he'd been up before dawn. Claire reminded herself to stay away from the side of the garden where the bees would be irritable in the morning. The moonlight wasn't keeping him awake, but something definitely was. "Ach, it's more than a foolish regret, Sassenach." He turned his head toward the trundle bed, where the dark spill of Brianna's hair fell in a moon-polished mass across the pillow. "I am only sorry that we must lose her." I let my hand rest flat on his chest. I had known it would come, both the realization and the parting itself, but I hadn't wanted to speak of it and break the temporary spell that had bound the three of us so closely. "You can't really lose a child," I said softly, one finger tracing the small, smooth hollow in the center of his chest. "She must go back, Sassenach. You know it as well as I do." He stirred impatiently, but didn't move away. "Look at her. She's like Louis's camel, no?" She didn't belong there, just like Louis's camel did not belong at Versailles either. Claire reiterates a child cannot be lost and asks if he remembers Faith. "Of course I do," he said softly. "Do you think I would ever forget?" No, the tears were flowing down my face, but I was not truly weeping. It was no more than the overflow of feeling. "That's what I mean. I never told you when we were in Paris to see Jared. I went to the Hôpital des Anges. I saw her grave there. I brought her a pink tulip." He was quiet for a moment. "I took her violets," he said softly. I almost didn't hear him. I was quite still for a moment, tears forgotten. "You didn't tell me." "Neither did you." His fingers traced the bumps of my spine, brushing softly up and down the line of my back. "I was afraid you'd feel..." My voice trailed off. I had been afraid he would feel guilty, worry that I blamed him. I once had, for the loss. We were newly reunited then. I had no wish to jeopardize the tender link between us. "So was I." "I'm sorry that you never saw her," I said at last, and felt him sigh. He turned toward me and put his arms around me, his lips brushing my forehead. "It does not matter, does it? Aye, it's true what you say, Sassenach. She was. And we will have her always. And Brianna, if when she goes, she will still be with us." "Yes, it doesn't matter what happens, no matter where a child goes. How far or how long, even if it's forever, you never lose them, you can't. He didn't answer, but his arms tightened round me, and he sighed once more. The breeze stirred the air above us with the sound of angels' wings, and we fell slowly asleep together as the moonlight bathed us in its ageless peace. A bonding moment through love and tragedy. There were so many things they haven't quite said yet. They weren't together very long before she went through the stones, and it's only been a few years since she returned. And with life being so hard and busy, there's no time to discuss these things until there is, like that moment, that night. They have Brianna, but it is a fleeting experience. They believe she must go back to her time. They grieve for something that hasn't happened yet. And what about Roger? I'm aggravated that they are calling him Mackenzie. Brianna knows he was using his birth name in the 18th century. And we get the theme of the bees. Claire wants a hive for honey. I mean, honey was the best sweetener. It was good for wounds. In order to keep infection down, it's good for putting over sutures and that sort of thing as well. It's also good for local seasonal allergies. So if you do suffer from local seasonal allergies, get raw unfiltered honey from somebody in your area, and you can take it every day, and it should calm your allergies to whatever plants, flowers are in your neighborhood. I love that tip. Brianna has been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and now that Lizzie is being cared for at Aunt Jo Costa's house, they got her some Jesuit bark, and hopefully she'll recover well, but she won't have to deal with the hardship of travel and doing all the maid-like duties either. And Fergus and Marsley are back together, and he's free, and that stupid Murchison, piff, as Diana would say. Oh, we're getting into the deep kind of meat of this book, and we're going to be doing 43 and 44 in the next podcast. You know, there are only 71 chapters, so we're going into the downhill slide, aren't we? We have no idea what happened to Roger. By this point, it's probably been at least a couple to a few weeks. I mean, it's not like it's a close trip from Riverrun up to Fraser's Ridge. So we have no idea what's going on with him. We'll have to see. Lots of things are brewing. This is sort of the calm before the storm, I think. So how can you participate in the podcast? Please leave me comments. You can email them to contact@adramaofoutlander.com or call the listener line at 719-425-9444 and leave me a voicemail, and I can save your voicemail and integrate it into the show. You can also leave me a note on the post that goes with the podcast on the website, adramaofoutlander.com. Or hey, you can head on over to Facebook to the A Dram of Outlander page or the A Dram of Outlander group, which you have to ask to join. Remember, 3 simple questions to make sure you're not a troll or a bot. We don't want any bots all over us in there. And you can also find a Dram of Outlander on Twitter and Instagram, except there's no A in front and it's just Dram of Outlander. But I want to get your feedback and hear your thoughts. I have some people who week in and week out send me their thoughts, but I would love to hear from more of you. It's really exciting to me to be able to look at what you believe and what you get contextually from the text, because my experiences differ from yours, and I've been reading these books since they came out, originally from the first one in 91, when I was a mere 24-year-old woman, And if you do the math, that means I'll be 51 soon. We keep on trucking, me and these books. Anyway, I did hear a little bit of news from the internet this week that there has been some Frank in season 4 filmed, and I wonder what that's going to be, because he shows up throughout the entire series of books here and there in flashback. So I'm really interested in finding out, and he is really important and integral to Brianna and to Claire. There's so much information, and look at what he did. He taught Brianna how to hunt and use guns. Why would he do that? Frank was a college professor. He wasn't really a hunter. He wasn't really an outdoorsman. So what did he know that caused him to give Brianna this foundation that she might need in the 18th century? Frank is very complex, and there's so much more to him than we have seen, and we get little windows of insight to Frank. I really like Frank. He wasn't perfect, and neither was Claire. And if he had affairs, he kept them to himself. This is where the character really, really diverges from the book and the TV show. They're very separate. And you cannot see the lens of TV show Frank in the book material at all, or vice versa. They are completely separate. And seeing what they did to film him in season 4 will be fascinating, because it appeared that he didn't love Claire anymore and that he lost faith and hope. But in the books, he still loved Claire, and he never really lost that faith and hope. And they were intimate up until the end, even though there were bumps and she was not emotionally available. There's so much more to him. So please don't be a Frank hater. Really be open-minded about who Book Frank is. And I think you'll learn to appreciate him for himself as much as I have in the long run. And no, I don't think he and Claire were a match anymore. She was too far in love with Jamie. There was too much invested in the 18th century. And she couldn't give him what he wanted and needed. She was not available. Her heart, it was blocked from him at that point. I mean, at least he couldn't really fully get in there and be part of her world the way he may have wanted to. So I have an email to read from Darren McClellan, and he's from Nova Scotia, Canada. I am a few chapters behind you as I am a slow reader, but I'm curious about your thoughts on Roger. I just got to the point where Roger finally meets up with Brianna at the tavern and basically yanks her by the arm out of there. I know he loves her, but he seems overly aggressive, almost like he is stalking her. He kisses her so hard I can imagine him pulling her head toward him. Bree doesn't seem to be as infatuated with him, but seems almost afraid of him and just goes along with it. Seems odd that she does the hand promise with him so soon after. Roger just seems a bit creepy to me so far. I guess I'll see what happens from here on. Thoughts? Thank you, Darren. Well, I think part of the reason it looks odd is because we only got Roger's point of view for a year and a half, plus a little more, from the time we see Brianna again. So from the time she turned down his proposal in Scotland that Christmas night to when they meet up again, it has been 20 months or something. So it's been a very long time before we ever hear or see from Brianna again. It's really difficult to know what she was really thinking and what she was doing. But remember, she sent him all her earthly belongings to Oxford. I think Roger is the more demonstrative of the two, where he is more clear about his feelings. And we got to see what he went through to find her. And his sole purpose was to find her and make sure she was okay. And the reason he grabbed her and did what he did was that sense of, sort of like when one of our children runs out into a busy street and you grab them and you want to shake them because you're so upset and worried, and then you hug them as hard as you can. I think it's that same reflex. So I don't think he's really being creepy or stalkery. I think it's more his emotions got the best of him and he couldn't contain them. And he was very worried for her, and he was worried by her change in behavior that she didn't love him. But come to find out, all her changes in behavior is because she does love him and wanted to be with him after she finished her adventure and meeting Jamie and telling her mother all about the death notice, etc. So she had a plan, and she wanted to keep Roger out of it, and so she had to start separating herself. But the reason she did was because she loves him wholly and completely. And what we saw in this chapter is, Roger keeps coming up. Even though she's really angry at him and feels betrayed that he didn't tell her about the death notice, he's still present. And she keeps having to push him down. And as she stated in the second chapter, is that Roger is one of the things that keeps her bound to the earth. There's only a few. She promised to take care of Lizzie, so she's her guardian. Roger, Claire, and Jamie. That's it. She didn't even mention Uncle Joe. That's how important Roger is, that he made that list. So it's interesting. I hope you can kind of step back and see him through his emotional filter. And I think he's somebody who, when he loves super hard, more like Jamie. Whereas you don't always see it demonstrated as much, like even from Claire, and I think Brianna is her mother's daughter in that way. She has her dad's fiery anger, but I think the way that she displays emotion is more of that British stiff upper lip growing up with Frank and Claire. You don't have to agree with me. I look forward to hearing more from you. And what else do you guys think? What do you think about Roger's reaction and how rough he was with her? Let me know. Contact at adreamofoutlander.com or 719-425-9444. And I have an email from our favorite Meredith, who sends one almost every week. Thank you for taking time, Meredith, to write me a note. I know that life is hectic, and so I appreciate you greatly. I love this first meeting between Brianna and Jamie. I hope that the TV adaptation stays fairly close to it. There are a couple of parts that need to be changed from the book. First, Jamie can't comment on Brianna's height. Sophie Skelton isn't beyond normal height. Second, why in the world does it come as a surprise that Claire found Jamie? She says it in the book. She found you, didn't she? Why in the world would Brianna doubt that? She saw the obituary notice herself. That's her motive for going through the stones, that they died together, and Jamie's family already confirmed that they are together. So why would it surprise Brianna in the slightest that Jamie has a wife at home? She said that because at that moment she wasn't sure that Jamie was Jamie. It could have been somebody else with his general description. And because he said he had a wife at home, and remember she had that encounter with Leary. So I think it was part of just her being surprised that she found him, and in her adrenaline at running out in the back and seeing him, and her mind was just kind of scattered. Like, yes, consciously she knew her mother was with Jamie, but since finding all that information out, Lollybrock hadn't heard from them in 6 months. Something could have happened to her mother in that time, along with Brianna's own travel time. So I think it was more set on the current circumstances and not getting further information from that one letter at Lollybrock, that a lot of time had passed. And so, maybe he didn't have Claire as a wife at home. She had no idea what could have transpired between them. I also want to see Brianna actually tell Claire and Jamie about their upcoming deaths. I know it wasn't necessary in the book, but television is a visual medium, so seeing the look on their faces would be really interesting. I agree. There was a passing comment in this last chapter that says that she had told them everything, when Jamie is thinking. But yes, it would be nice to see that conversation. I also want to hear their reactions upon hearing that Roger is also in this time. Claire was always fond of Roger, so I'd like her reaction to hearing that she'll see him again and the fear that he might be stuck there too. I was glad that Brianna didn't tell them about Roger's secret, that he knew about their deaths and didn't tell her. I think the main reason is that because of her encounter with Stephen Bonnet, that she realized that he was absolutely right to want to keep her safe in their time. I'm also wondering if the show will reveal what happened with Stephen Bonnet in immediate time, or if viewers will find out in flashback like they do later in the book. I don't know. There's always a press for time. I'm a writer, and if it was up to me, I'd show the fallout between Roger and Brianna about 10 minutes from the end of the episode. Then I'd show Brianna boarding the ship of Stephen Bonnet in the last scene. Woo! You're spicy, Meredith. I like the way you think. Then in the next episode, I'd show Brianna exiting the ship looking very shaken, but not having it be clear what happened. To me, this is the best approach for people who haven't read the book. Sincerely, Meredith of Everett, Washington. I like your style, Meredith, and I think that could work. We get 13 episodes. I know that when Brianna meets him in the show, Jamie, that he is peeing by a tree because it was one of those heard on set today tweets that I saw. Everything else is up for grabs. And I really do hope they get a super excited Clarence who just loves people and is a raging extrovert. Because who doesn't love the animals of Fraser's Ridge? I do. We'll see. I have no idea. We have not gotten a whole lot about season 4, and they're basically wrapping any time now. I bet we're going to get little snippets here and there, but we have till November to wait. We have some time. Speaking of having some time, since the read-along of Drums of Autumn will be done earlier, I would like some more input on what smaller novellas or that you would like to hear as a read-along in between. Because we're going to have probably about 5 weeks, 5-6 weeks of episodes that I could probably barrel through something. I just don't want to do one of the novellas that gives out too much information that may relate to a later book. So please vote on that. Give me your input. I need to know because I will be starting to go through them and figuring it out. Okay. I appreciate you all so very much, and you can really help the website. You can really help the podcast by going to Apple Podcasts and iTunes and leaving me a favorable review, or on Stitcher, Google Play, or Spotify. That really does help people find me. I'm continually growing, but this is really word of mouth, and the more that you guys put it out there, the more that people will find the podcast. So go onto the Facebook page and group and interact with each other on Twitter, interact with me on Instagram. All of it helps. And share the podcast, share the posts that go with the podcast. And I did put a link to how to hunt bees in the post, as well as a couple other things. There weren't very many this week. This was more about interpersonal interaction than things that I could find links for you. Oh, I did find an interesting tidbit about Cross Creek. Let me find it for you. That in 1778, Cross Creek and Campbellton merged, and then in 1783, they became known as Fayetteville, North Carolina. So there's your little history lesson for the day. I had no idea that happened. So it still exists, but under a different name. So the last way that you can support the podcast is financially. I'm a one-person writer, producer, taking care of all the little details of the podcast. And if you see fit to bless me, you can go to patreon.com/a dram of Outlander and leave a monthly gift as small as $1. Every penny counts. Everything costs money that I do here. And I do it because I love it and I appreciate you, and I'm going to keep doing it. But it does help getting support. The other way that you can financially support the podcast is to send me a voicemail or an email and do a one-time offering. So I appreciate you, and I am excited that I'll continue to do with you this podcast for years. That's my goal. Because regardless of when the TV show ends, there's always Outlander things to talk about, right? So until next time, slán je va.